The strongest men don't always bow before kings. Sometimes, they bow before the person who once gave them a reason to keep living. Those words would have sounded impossible to anyone who had ever heard the name Damian Cross. Across the city, his reputation traveled faster than headlines. Whispered in luxury boardrooms, neighborhood diners, and quiet family kitchens alike. People spoke of him as a man who never hesitated, never apologized, and never lowered his head for anyone. The Cross estate reflected that same reputation. Rising above the surrounding hills on nearly 20 acres of carefully maintained grounds, the mansion overlooked the city like a silent fortress. Every polished window, every stone pathway, and every iron gate reminded visitors that discipline ruled here above all else. Employees understood the unspoken rules before they even signed their contracts. Arrive early. Speak only when necessary. Never create problems. Ethan Brooks had memorized those rules long before his first day as one of the estate's housekeeping staff. At 23, he had learned that quiet determination often carried a person farther than loud ambition. Every morning before sunrise, he rode the city bus for nearly 50 minutes, carrying a simple backpack containing his lunch, an extra uniform shirt, and the small notebook where he carefully tracked every dollar he earned. His grandmother always reminded him that dignity was something nobody could steal unless he willingly surrendered it. That thought stayed with him as he stepped through the employee entrance before 6 o'clock, greeting the security officers with the same polite smile he offered every day. The estate was already alive with activity. Gardeners trimmed the hedges into perfect lines. Kitchen staff prepared breakfast for dozens of residents, executives, and visiting guests. Maintenance workers inspected fountains and lighting while assistants reviewed schedules that seemed to change every hour. Although hundreds of people worked throughout the estate, an unusual silence hovered over everyone that morning. It wasn't fear exactly. It was anticipation. Ethan noticed it immediately when Victor Hale, the estate's senior manager, walked briskly through the main corridor carrying a digital tablet. Victor rarely raised his voice, yet every employee instinctively straightened when he entered a room. Final inspection in 30 minutes, he announced calmly. Every hallway, every guest suite, every dining room must be spotless. Mr. Cross returns today. Those 4 words spread through the mansion faster than any alarm. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Several newer employees exchanged nervous glances, while longtime staff quietly increased their pace without complaint. Ethan had never met Damian Cross in person. During his first 6 months at the estate, the owner had been traveling continuously between international business meetings and private family matters. Ethan knew him only through framed photographs hanging inside executive offices and occasional television interviews shown in the employee lounge. In every image, Damian appeared perfectly composed, wearing tailored charcoal suits, his expression calm enough to reveal almost nothing. Stories surrounding him varied wildly, depending on who was speaking. Some described him as demanding but fair. Others insisted he remembered every employee's name. A few claimed he could recognize even the smallest mistake without anyone pointing it out. Ethan had no way of knowing which stories were true. He only hoped to remain invisible. After collecting fresh linens, he entered the East Wing to prepare several guest rooms expected to host important visitors later that week. The work was familiar and comforting. He smoothed every sheet without wrinkles, aligned decorative pillows precisely, polished mirrors until they reflected sunlight like glassy lakes, and watered the fresh white orchids placed beside each window. Small details mattered inside the Cross estate. Excellence was expected even when nobody appeared to notice. Around mid-morning, the peaceful rhythm changed. A distant engine echoed beyond the front gates. Another followed, then several more. The sound rolled across the property like approaching thunder, drawing quiet attention from every nearby employee. Victor's voice came through the estate communication system. Mr. Cross has arrived. All assigned personnel remain at your stations. Ethan happened to be carrying a polished silver tea service toward the grand entrance when the convoy entered the circular driveway. Dark luxury vehicles glided across the stone drive before stopping one after another beneath the towering columns. Security personnel opened doors with practiced precision. Executives stepped aside respectfully. Every employee standing within view lowered their eyes. Ethan instinctively slowed his pace. balancing the tray carefully as the final sedan came to a stop. The rear door opened. Damian Cross stepped onto the stone walkway, wearing an impeccably tailored black suit. Sunlight caught the subtle tattoo that disappeared beneath the collar along the side of his neck before his jacket settled naturally into place. His posture was effortless, his movements measured, and his quiet presence somehow commanded more attention than any speech could have. The estate itself seemed to pause as he walked toward the entrance. Ethan carefully shifted the weight of the tea service, determined not to draw attention. But as another employee hurried past carrying stacked supply boxes, an accidental shoulder bump disrupted his balance. One porcelain cup slipped free, striking the polished marble floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the entrance hall. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward the young housekeeper standing frozen beside the shattered cup, while Damian Cross slowly lifted his gaze toward him. The sharp sound of broken porcelain lingered in the grand entrance like an unwelcome echo. Ethan Brooks remained perfectly still, his heartbeat loud enough that he wondered if everyone around him could hear it. Tiny white fragments rested across the polished marble floor beside a spreading pool of tea, transforming a routine morning into the kind of mistake employees whispered about for months. No one moved. Even the housekeepers carrying fresh linens froze where they stood. Victor Hale closed the digital tablet in his hands and quietly walked toward the accident, his expression impossible to read. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately. "I am very sorry," he said, his voice calm despite the knot tightening in his chest. "It was entirely my fault." Before Victor could answer, Damian Cross continued walking. His polished shoes stopped only a few feet from the shattered cup. Ethan expected a cold reprimand, perhaps even dismissal. Instead, Damian studied the broken porcelain for a brief moment before looking directly at Ethan. His gray eyes revealed neither anger nor disappointment. "Was anyone injured?" he asked. The unexpected question surprised everyone. Ethan blinked once before answering honestly. "No, sir." Damian gave a small nod. "Then replace the cup and continue your work." Without another word, he resumed walking through the entrance hall. The entire exchange lasted less than 15 seconds, yet it completely disrupted every rumor Ethan had ever heard about the mysterious owner of the estate. Victor waited until Damian disappeared beyond the corridor before quietly handing Ethan a cleaning cloth. "Clean this carefully," he said. "And next time, remember that balance begins with breathing." Ethan nodded gratefully. "Thank you." Throughout the afternoon, conversations drifted back toward normal, although several employees still glanced curiously in Ethan's direction. More than one admitted they had expected a far harsher reaction. Ethan tried not to think about it. He focused instead on polishing silver trays, organizing guest suites, and helping prepare the formal dining room for that evening's executive gathering. By the time his shift ended, the sun had begun dipping behind the western hills, casting long golden shadows across the estate grounds. Rather than boarding the bus immediately, Ethan stepped into the employee courtyard to call the one person who always made difficult days feel lighter. His grandmother answered before the second ring. "Have you eaten?" Margaret Brooks asked warmly, exactly as she always did. Ethan smiled despite his exhaustion. "I will after I get home." "That means you have not eaten yet," she replied knowingly. He laughed softly. "You always figure it out." Her gentle laughter followed. Grandmothers have experience. They spoke for only a few minutes about ordinary things. The neighborhood grocery store had finally repaired its front sign. The roses outside their apartment building had started blooming again. Her latest medical appointment had gone well, and the doctor was pleased with her progress. Before ending the call, her voice became thoughtful. "I have been thinking about visiting you at work someday." Ethan immediately straightened. "Grandma, there is no need. I simply want to see where my grandson spends so many hours. Visitors are not really encouraged." "Then I will stand outside and wave." Ethan laughed, but concern quietly settled inside him. "Please promise me you will call first." "I promise I will try," she answered with playful warmth. After the call ended, Ethan slipped his phone into his pocket and looked back toward the enormous mansion glowing beneath the evening sky. Somewhere inside those stone walls, Damian Cross was attending meetings that influenced companies, charities, and thousands of employees. Ethan could not imagine their lives crossing again after that morning. Yet as the lights gradually illuminated the estate, Neither he nor anyone else could have guessed that before another day ended, one quiet visit from an elderly grandmother would leave the most powerful man in the city standing completely still before the front gate. The following afternoon unfolded with the same disciplined rhythm that defined every day inside the Cross estate. Yet Ethan Brooks could not shake the strange feeling left behind by his conversation with his grandmother. Every time his phone vibrated inside his pocket, he instinctively checked the screen, half expecting another cheerful message reminding him to eat lunch or wear a warmer jacket on the way home. Instead, the hours passed quietly. He spent the morning arranging fresh flowers throughout the mansion, replacing elegant white lilies in the reception hall, and carefully trimming roses for the formal dining room. Around him, executives arrived for private meetings while assistants hurried through polished corridors carrying folders and tablets. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary until shortly before sunset, when one of the security officers suddenly spoke into his radio with unusual urgency. Another guard immediately left the front entrance and walked briskly toward the estate gates. Curious whispers spread among nearby employees. Ethan looked through the tall front windows and felt his heart skip. Standing patiently beyond the ornate iron gates was Margaret Brooks. She wore the same light gray cardigan she favored on cool evenings and carried a small cloth bag in one hand. The gentle smile on her face suggested she saw nothing intimidating about the enormous mansion before her. She simply looked happy to have arrived. Ethan hurried toward the entrance, but one of the senior security officers politely stepped into his path. "Visitors must receive advance approval," the officer explained. "She is my grandmother," Ethan answered quickly. "She only wants to see me for a few minutes." The officer remained respectful but firm. "I understand, but the estate is currently hosting important guests." Ethan glanced anxiously toward the gate, where Margaret stood waiting without the slightest sign of frustration. She noticed him immediately and lifted one hand in a warm wave. "Do not worry, Ethan," she called gently. "I brought you dinner because I knew you might forget again." Several nearby employees exchanged quiet smiles. Others watched with growing curiosity. Victor Hale approached the entrance after hearing the conversation. Before he could speak, another sound echoed across the circular driveway. A convoy of dark vehicles entered through the front gates, signaling Damian Cross's return from an afternoon meeting downtown. Every employee instinctively straightened. Security personnel stepped aside while the lead sedan rolled toward the mansion. Ethan's attention shifted between the arriving vehicles and his grandmother, still waiting patiently beyond the security checkpoint. The rear door of the sedan opened. Damian stepped onto the stone driveway wearing a charcoal suit that reflected the fading evening light. The subtle tattoo disappearing beneath the collar along his neck was briefly visible as he adjusted one cuff before walking toward the entrance. Conversations stopped completely. Damian acknowledged the executives with a quiet nod before his gaze drifted almost casually toward the front gate. He took another step, then suddenly stopped. The calm expression everyone associated with him remained composed, yet something behind his eyes unmistakably changed. His attention fixed on Margaret's left hand. Ethan followed his gaze and noticed the old silver ring his grandmother had worn for as long as he could remember. Margaret adjusted it absent-mindedly, while smiling politely toward the mansion, completely unaware that every person around her had begun watching Damian instead. The silence became almost overwhelming. Damian slowly walked away from the entrance and toward the gate, ignoring the surprised looks from executives and security officers alike. Ethan stood frozen, unable to understand what was happening. Victor Hale lowered his tablet without saying a word. Margaret looked pleasantly confused as Damian stopped directly before her. For one suspended moment, neither of them spoke. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, the most powerful man in the city slowly lowered his head before the elderly woman standing outside his gates, a gesture so unexpected that the entire estate seemed to forget how to breathe. For several long seconds, nobody inside the Cross estate moved. The evening breeze gently stirred the hedges lining the entrance while Damian Cross remained standing before Margaret Brooks with his head respectfully lowered. Executives exchanged uncertain glances, security officers silently waited for instructions that never came, and employees who had spent years inside the estate struggled to believe what they were witnessing. Ethan felt as though the world around him had slowed to a heartbeat. His grandmother looked at Damien with kind but puzzled eyes before smiling politely. "Young man," she said softly, "I believe you have mistaken me for someone else." Damien slowly raised his head. His usually composed expression carried a warmth that no one present had ever seen before. "No, Mrs. Brooks," he answered quietly. "I have never forgotten your face." Margaret searched his features carefully. Time had changed him. The frightened boy she had once known had become a confident man whose name now carried extraordinary influence. Yet something familiar lingered behind his calm gray eyes. She studied him for another moment before her expression slowly brightened with surprise. "Daniel?" she whispered. Ethan blinked in confusion. Damien smiled gently for the first time that day. "It has been many years since anyone called me that." A wave of astonishment passed through everyone standing nearby. Ethan stared from his grandmother to Damien, unable to understand how their lives could possibly have crossed before. Damien turned toward Victor Hale. "Please open the gates." Victor nodded immediately. Moments later, the heavy iron gates swung inward. Damien stepped aside instead of leading the way, inviting Margaret to enter first. "It would be an honor if you joined me for tea," he said respectfully. Margaret glanced toward Ethan with uncertainty. "I only came to bring my grandson dinner." She lifted the small cloth bag she had been carrying all along. Damien looked at the homemade container inside and smiled again. "Then perhaps we can all share it." Ethan followed them into the mansion in complete disbelief. Employees quietly stepped aside as the three walked through the grand entrance together. The luxurious reception hall suddenly felt less like the headquarters of a powerful family and more like the home of someone welcoming an old friend. Damien personally pulled out a chair in the private sitting room before Margaret could sit down. Another silent shock spread among the household staff watching discreetly from the hallway. Victor dismissed everyone except one server who quietly prepared tea before leaving the room as well. Once they were alone, Margaret carefully removed the old silver ring from her finger and placed it on the polished wooden table. "I wondered if anyone would ever recognize this again," she said softly. Damien looked at the ring with unmistakable emotion. "I searched for it for years." Ethan listened in silence, realizing there was an entire chapter of his grandmother's life he had never heard. Margaret folded her hands comfortably. "You disappeared before I could even learn what became of you." Damien nodded slowly. "You told me that surviving was more important than remembering my name. I followed your advice." He paused before continuing. "Everything I have built began because of one evening when you refused to walk past a frightened child standing alone outside a small bus station." Ethan's eyes widened. His grandmother had never mentioned anything like that. Margaret gave a quiet laugh, filled with gentle humility. "I only offered a frightened boy a warm meal and a safe place until help arrived." Damien looked at her with sincere gratitude. "You gave him something far greater than that. You reminded him that kindness still existed." Ethan finally understood why the impossible moment outside the gates had unfolded the way it had. To everyone else, Damien Cross was a man whose authority shaped the future of powerful organizations. But to Damien himself, Margaret Brooks was the stranger whose simple compassion had quietly changed the course of his entire life decades earlier. The evening that began with quiet astonishment soon transformed into something far greater than anyone inside the Cross estate could have imagined. News traveled quickly through the mansion, although no one dared speak loudly about it. Employees who had spent years believing Damien Cross never showed personal emotion now found themselves repeating the same unbelievable story in careful whispers. The owner of the estate had personally welcomed an elderly visitor, served her tea, and spoken to her with the respect usually reserved for the most honored guests. Ethan Brooks remained seated beside his grandmother, still trying to understand how a simple act of kindness from decades earlier could carry such extraordinary weight. Damien listened patiently as Margaret recalled fragments of the past that even she had nearly forgotten. She described a frightened teenage boy sitting alone outside a small bus station during a cold autumn evening, wearing clothes far too thin for the weather and pretending he was not afraid. She remembered buying 2 bowls of hot soup from a nearby diner because she believed no young person should face hardship on an empty stomach. Damien smiled quietly, as though each memory restored another missing piece of himself. "You never asked where I came from," he said. Margaret gently shook her head. "You looked like someone who needed peace more than questions." Ethan noticed Damien lower his eyes for a brief moment before speaking again. Many people try to discover my past because they believed it could benefit them. You were the only person who believed I deserved a future instead. Before Margaret could answer, Victor Hale entered the sitting room and respectfully waited near the doorway. "Mr. Cross," he said, "the board members have arrived for the evening meeting." Damien acknowledged him with a slight nod, but made no effort to stand. "Please inform them the meeting will begin 30 minutes later." Victor looked briefly surprised before responding, "Yes, sir." Once the door closed again, Ethan realized the importance of what had just happened. Senior executives from across the company rarely waited for anyone. Yet Damien had postponed an entire board meeting without hesitation. Margaret smiled warmly. "You should not keep important people waiting because of an old woman." Damien answered with complete sincerity. "The people waiting downstairs help me manage a company. The woman sitting across from me helped me become the kind of person capable of leading one." Those words settled deeply inside Ethan. Throughout his life, he had measured success through hard work, long shifts, and paying bills on time. Watching his grandmother receive gratitude from one of the city's most influential men reminded him that the smallest acts of compassion often reached farther than anyone could measure. Later that evening, Damien personally walked Ethan and Margaret toward the front entrance. As they passed through the marble hallway, employees quietly stepped aside, not because they had been instructed to do so, but because respect now extended naturally toward the elderly woman walking beside the estate owner. Outside, the evening air had turned comfortably cool. Damien noticed Margaret adjusting her cardigan against the breeze. Without making a grand gesture, he asked one of the attendants to bring a warm shawl from inside the mansion. Margaret accepted it with grateful laughter. "You still worry too much," she teased. Damien smiled. "Perhaps I learned that from you." As Ethan prepared to leave with his grandmother, Damien spoke once more. "Mrs. Brooks, I hope this will not be your last visit." She looked at him kindly. "Only if you promise to stop treating me like royalty." Damien chuckled softly. "I cannot promise that." Ethan laughed with them, unaware that several people standing across the street had quietly observed the remarkable scene from a distance. Among them was Gavin Mercer, a wealthy business rival whose interest had never centered on family or gratitude, but on understanding every unexpected change surrounding Damien Cross. Watching the estate owner escort an ordinary elderly woman to the gates with unmistakable respect, Gavin folded his arms thoughtfully. "Find out everything about that family," he instructed one of his associates in a calm voice. "If they matter to Damien Cross, they matter to me." Neither Ethan nor Margaret noticed the black sedan slowly pulling away into the evening traffic. They simply walked toward the nearby bus stop together, talking about homemade vegetable stew and tomorrow's grocery list, completely unaware that their ordinary lives had just become connected to a much larger story. The following morning began with clear skies and the familiar comfort of ordinary routines, but neither Ethan Brooks nor Margaret Brooks realized that someone had quietly begun paying attention to every step they took. Ethan arrived at the Cross estate before sunrise as usual, greeting the security officers with the same polite smile that had become part of his daily routine. Yet this morning felt different. Employees who had barely noticed him before now greeted him warmly, not because his position had changed, but because everyone had witnessed the remarkable respect Damien Cross had shown his grandmother. Ethan remained humble despite the unexpected attention. He completed every assignment with the same quiet dedication, polishing silver, arranging fresh flowers, and helping prepare conference rooms for another full day of meetings. Meanwhile, Damien spent the morning reviewing business reports with Victor Hale. Numbers filled the large display screens, yet Damien's attention drifted more than once toward the window overlooking the estate grounds. Finally, Victor set aside one report and spoke carefully. "May I ask you something, sir?" Damien nodded. "You may." Victor hesitated for only a moment. "You have built one of the most respected organizations in the country. Yesterday was the first time I have ever seen you postpone a board meeting." Damien looked out toward the gardens before answering. "There are people who help you build success, Victor. Then there are people who help you become someone worthy of success. Those two things are not the same." Victor quietly accepted the answer. At nearly the same moment across town, Gavin Mercer sat inside a private office overlooking the financial district. A tablet rested on the conference table, displaying photographs taken outside the Cross estate the previous evening. None of the images showed anything dramatic. Ethan carrying his grandmother's cloth bag, Margaret smiling beside the estate gates, Damien escorting them toward the sidewalk. Yet Gavin studied every photograph with unusual interest. "Everything about Damien Cross is calculated," he said calmly to one of his advisors. "If he openly honors someone, there is a reason." The advisor opened another folder. "We have already confirmed the young man's name is Ethan Brooks. He works as a housekeeper. The elderly woman is his grandmother." Gavin folded his hands thoughtfully. "Continue learning about them. Quietly. No pressure. No interference. I simply want to understand why they matter." Back at the estate, Ethan finished his shift shortly before sunset. Instead of taking the bus immediately, he stopped at a neighborhood grocery store to purchase fresh vegetables, bread, and tea for his grandmother. As always, he carefully compared prices before making each selection. The cashier smiled as she packed the groceries. "Cooking for family tonight." Ethan returned the smile. "My grandmother insists homemade soup fixes everything." "She sounds wise." "She is." When Ethan arrived home, he found Margaret tending several flower pots outside their modest apartment building. She looked up happily the moment she saw him. "You remembered the tea." Ethan laughed. "I remember because you remind me every week." Together, they carried the groceries upstairs, preparing dinner while talking about simple things that had nothing to do with wealth or powerful families. Margaret described a neighbor's new puppy. Ethan shared a funny story about one of the gardeners accidentally watering his own boots instead of the roses. Their laughter filled the small apartment with a warmth that expensive mansions could never manufacture. Later that evening, while washing the dishes, Ethan noticed an unfamiliar black sedan parked across the street for several minutes before quietly driving away. He assumed it belonged to someone visiting another building and thought nothing more about it. What he could not know was that the brief observation had already been recorded inside Gavin Mercer's growing file. Far away, Damien stood alone in his office, overlooking the lights of the city. He remembered the frightened boy he had once been and the elderly woman who had offered kindness without asking for anything in return. For the first time in many years, protecting his future no longer felt like his greatest responsibility. Protecting the people who had quietly shaped that future did. Several quiet days passed, and life seemed to settle into a comfortable rhythm once again. But beneath the calm surface, small changes were beginning to reshape the future of everyone connected to the Cross estate. Ethan Brooks noticed the first difference during the weekly employee meeting when Victor Hale unexpectedly asked him to remain after everyone else had left the room. Ethan immediately wondered whether he had made another mistake. Instead, Victor offered him a gentle smile. "Mr. Cross has reviewed your work evaluations," he said. "Your supervisors consistently describe you as dependable, respectful, and attentive. Beginning next week, you will assist with responsibilities inside the main residence instead of remaining exclusively with the housekeeping staff." Ethan blinked in surprise. "I appreciate the opportunity," he answered honestly. "I will do my best." Victor nodded. "That is precisely why you were chosen." The promotion was modest, but for Ethan it represented something important. It meant additional hours, slightly higher pay, and a chance to help his grandmother without worrying so much about monthly expenses. That evening, he brought home a small bakery pie to celebrate. Margaret laughed when she saw it resting on the kitchen table. "You know this is far too much for two people." Ethan grinned. "You say that every time, and somehow the pie always disappears." They shared dessert while watching an old movie, grateful for a simple evening together. Across town, however, Gavin Mercer had reached a different conclusion after reviewing several days of reports. His investigators found nothing unusual about Ethan or Margaret. They paid their bills on time, volunteered at neighborhood events whenever possible, and lived modestly without attracting attention. That ordinary life puzzled Gavin even more. "There has to be another reason," he murmured while studying the file. "Damien Cross never changes long-established habits without extraordinary cause." One advisor suggested closing the investigation. Gavin slowly shook his head. "No. We continue observing, but no one approaches them. I want understanding, not confrontation." Meanwhile, Damien invited Ethan into his office for the first time. The spacious room overlooked the city skyline, yet its shelves contained more family photographs and old books than Ethan expected. Damien motioned toward a chair. Please sit. Ethan hesitated before carefully taking the offered seat. You have served this estate with sincerity since your first day, Damien began. Victor tells me you solve problems quietly instead of creating them. Ethan smiled modestly. I simply try to do my job well. Damien leaned back thoughtfully. Your grandmother once taught me that character is revealed through ordinary habits rather than dramatic moments. Watching you these past months reminded me she was right. Ethan felt unexpectedly moved. She always believed consistency mattered more than recognition. Damien nodded. She was wiser than many executives I have met. He opened a folder resting on his desk. The estate sponsors educational programs for employees wishing to continue their studies. I would like you to consider applying. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. I never imagined that was possible. Why not? Damien asked kindly. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment. Sometimes people become so focused on paying today's bills that tomorrow begins to feel like a luxury. Damien quietly understood those words better than Ethan realized. Tomorrow is exactly what your grandmother protected for me many years ago, he replied. Perhaps now it is my turn to protect yours. Ethan accepted the application packet with grateful hands, promising only that he would think carefully before making a decision. Later that evening, Damien walked alone through the estate gardens, reflecting on the conversation. Victor joined him after finishing the final reports of the day. You trust him, Victor observed. Damien smiled faintly. I trust the values that shaped him. As the garden lights illuminated the pathways, neither man noticed a camera lens capturing distant images from outside the property. Gavin's investigators remained patient, recording nothing more than ordinary conversations and peaceful evenings. Yet each new observation strengthened one undeniable truth. Damien Cross was changing, and for the first time in years, the source of that change was not power, business, or ambition. It was the quiet influence of a family that had never asked for anything except the chance to live with dignity. 1 week later, the annual Cross Foundation community reception transformed the estate into a gathering place unlike any Ethan Brooks had ever seen. Teachers, firefighters, nurses, local business owners, scholarship recipients, and civic leaders filled the grand ballroom instead of the executives who usually occupied its polished halls. Damien Cross had quietly expanded the event over the years, insisting that people who strengthen the community deserve the same respect often reserved for wealthy investors. Ethan spent the afternoon helping coordinate guests, arranging refreshments, and welcoming visitors with the calm confidence he had gradually developed since joining the estate. Margaret Brooks arrived shortly before sunset, wearing a simple navy dress with a familiar silver ring resting once again upon her hand. She immediately apologized for coming empty-handed before smiling and lifting a small container. Actually, she laughed, I brought homemade cookies. Ethan shook his head with affectionate amusement. Grandma, you always bring something. Because kindness should never arrive with empty hands, she answered. Damien overheard the exchange as he approached the entrance. Mrs. Brooks, he said warmly, I was hoping you would come. She smiled. Only because my grandson promised you would not let me wash dishes afterward. Damien chuckled softly. That promise will certainly be honored. Throughout the evening, guests repeatedly stopped to thank Damien for scholarships, neighborhood improvement grants, and youth programs supported by the foundation. Yet Ethan noticed something different about the conversations. Damien never accepted the praise for himself. Every compliment became an opportunity to recognize volunteers, teachers, or employees who had made the project successful. Watching quietly from nearby, Margaret nodded with quiet satisfaction. He learned, she whispered. Ethan looked toward her. Learned what? She watched Damien greeting another family before answering. That real leadership is measured by how many people stand taller because of you. Those words remained in Ethan's mind long after the reception reached its busiest hour. Later that evening, Damien stepped onto the stage to thank everyone for attending. Instead of delivering the carefully prepared remarks resting on the podium, he folded the pages and placed them aside. There is someone here tonight, he began, who taught me a lesson long before I understood its value. Many years ago, when I had nothing to offer anyone, one person chose compassion without asking who I was, where I came from, or what I might become. Success often convinces us that achievements create character. My experience taught me the opposite. Character creates every achievement worth celebrating. The audience listened in complete silence as Damien looked toward Margaret. "Mrs. Margaret Brooks, would you please join me?" Clearly surprised, Margaret slowly walked to the stage while guests applauded politely, uncertain what was happening. Damien accepted the small container of homemade cookies she still carried and smiled. "These may be the most valuable gift I received this year," he said, prompting warm laughter throughout the ballroom. He then turned toward the audience. "Beginning today, the Cross Foundation Community Service Scholarship will be renamed the Margaret Brooks Scholarship for Quiet Kindness. It will support young people whose actions improve the lives of others without seeking recognition." Tears gathered in Margaret's eyes as she gently shook her head. "I never asked for anything like this." Damien answered softly enough that only those nearest the stage clearly heard him. "Exactly. That is why your name belongs on it." Ethan felt overwhelming pride as the audience rose in a standing ovation, not for wealth or influence, but for a lifetime of ordinary goodness. Across the room, Gavin Mercer watched the scene unfold after accepting an invitation to the reception. He quietly closed the investigation file he had carried with him. There had never been a hidden business advantage, a political alliance, or a carefully designed strategy. The answer had been far simpler than he ever imagined. Damien Cross was honoring a debt that money could never repay. For the first time, Gavin understood that the greatest strength inside the Cross estate had never been power at all. It had always been gratitude. Nearly 1 year passed, and the changes that had quietly begun with a single unexpected reunion continued to shape countless lives in ways no one could have predicted. Ethan Brooks completed the educational program sponsored by the Cross Foundation while continuing to work at the estate, eventually accepting a new position coordinating community outreach projects that connected local families with scholarships, training opportunities, and neighborhood support services. He often smiled when he realized that his office overlooked the same gardens he had once cared for as a quiet housekeeper. Although his responsibilities had grown, his habits had not. He still greeted every employee by name, still arrived before sunrise, and still carried homemade lunches prepared with his grandmother whenever she insisted he needed to eat better. Margaret Brooks remained exactly as everyone loved her to be. She never behaved as though her name appeared on a scholarship, never accepted special treatment, and never allowed recognition to change the gentle rhythm of her life. Every Thursday afternoon, she visited the foundation office with fresh baked goods, claiming she simply wanted to make sure nobody was working on an empty stomach. Staff members soon learned that her visits brightened the entire building more effectively than any celebration could. Damien Cross continued leading his organization with the same discipline that had built its success. Yet those closest to him noticed subtle differences impossible to ignore. Board meetings still began on time. Business standards remained uncompromising. Expectations stayed high. But alongside every financial report now appeared discussions about employee education, family assistance, volunteer programs, and community partnerships. Victor Hale often joked that the annual reports had become twice as thick. Damien would simply smile and answer that the strongest companies invested in people long before expecting results. Even Gavin Mercer experienced an unexpected change. Months after closing his investigation, he quietly introduced similar scholarship initiatives within his own organization, never admitting publicly what had inspired the decision. During one community event, he crossed paths with Damien and offered a respectful handshake. "You taught me something without ever intending to," Gavin admitted. Damien looked genuinely curious. "What was that?" Gavin smiled faintly. "That gratitude is far more persuasive than competition." The conversation lasted less than a minute, yet it marked the beginning of mutual respect between two men who had once viewed each other only through the lens of rivalry. One crisp autumn evening, the Cross estate hosted a small private dinner rather than a formal reception. There were no television cameras, no reporters, and no distinguished guests. Around a long wooden table overlooking the garden sat Damien, Ethan, Margaret, Victor, several longtime employees, and a handful of scholarship recipients who had become part of the extended foundation family. The meal itself was wonderfully ordinary. Homemade vegetable stew prepared from Margaret's favorite recipe filled the room with familiar warmth. Fresh bread disappeared almost as quickly as it reached the table. Laughter echoed through the open windows while stories from the past blended naturally with hopes for the future. At one point, Ethan looked around the table and realized that everyone present came from remarkably different backgrounds. Yet each person belonged there because someone, somewhere, had chosen kindness instead of indifference. Damien quietly lifted his glass of iced tea. Many people believe power changes the world, he said. I no longer agree. One compassionate decision, made without expecting anything in return, can travel farther than generations ever imagined. Margaret smiled gently before reaching across the table to pat his hand with grandmotherly affection. Then promise me one thing, she said. Damien nodded immediately. Anything. When someone else needs that same kindness one day, make certain they receive it. Damien answered without hesitation. I promise. The garden lights softly illuminated the evening as conversation continued long after dinner ended. Looking at the people gathered together, Ethan finally understood the lesson his grandmother had quietly lived every day. Wealth could build beautiful homes. Influence could open important doors. Success could earn admiration. But only genuine kindness possessed the extraordinary ability to transform strangers into family, gratitude into legacy, and one forgotten act of compassion into a future that reached far beyond anything a single person could ever accomplish. What would you have done if you were in this situation? Tell us in the comments. If you love Alpha and Omega stories filled with passion, loyalty, heartbreak, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.